Commander Vextal stepped out of his sleek silver transport ship onto the dusty ground of Sol Defense Academy. His massive frame cast a long shadow across the simple concrete walkway. Standing nearly 10 feet tall with dark green scales covering his muscular body, he looked like something straight out of a nightmare. 4 glowing yellow eyes scanned the modest buildings spread across the campus, and his forked tongue flicked out to taste the strange air of this backwater planet called Earth. The alien commander had conquered 47 different worlds across the galaxy. Each time it followed the same predictable pattern. First came the diplomatic visit to study the local military, then came the recommendations to his superiors. Finally came the invasion fleets and the swift surrender of another primitive species. Today should be no different. Captain Jin-Ho Kim approached with measured steps, his polished boots clicking against the pavement. Despite facing a creature that could probably tear him in half without breaking a sweat, the human officer maintained perfect military posture. His dark eyes met the alien's gaze without flinching, and he offered a crisp salute. "Welcome to Sol Defense Academy, Commander Vextal," Jin-Ho said in fluent galactic standard. "I'm Captain Kim, your assigned liaison for today's inspection tour." Vextal's mandibles clicked together in what passed for amusement among his species. The human barely reached his chest, yet showed no signs of the terror he typically inspired. Most species cowered when meeting a Dominion commander for the first time. These humans seemed almost casual about the whole affair. "Your planetary government speaks highly of this institution," Vextal replied, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. "The Dominion Council is curious about human military traditions before we begin integration. Procedures." The word integration hung in the air like a threat, though Vextal delivered it with diplomatic politeness. Both beings understood its true meaning. Soon humanity would join the growing list of client species serving the Dominion Empire. This inspection was merely a formality. "Of course, sir." "We're honored by your interest," Kim replied smoothly. "Would you prefer to begin with our training facilities or academic buildings?" Vextal studied the human's face for any hint of deception or hidden fear. He found neither. Either this Captain Kim possessed remarkable self-control, or humans were even more primitive than intelligence reports suggested. Perhaps they didn't fully grasp the situation they faced. "Academic facilities first," the commander decided. "I wish to understand how you prepare your young for warfare." As they walked across the central courtyard, groups of cadets in simple gray uniforms moved between buildings. Vextal noted their relaxed posture and easy laughter. On Dominion worlds, military trainees marched in rigid formation and spoke only when commanded. These human youth seemed to treat their academy like some sort of social gathering. "Tell me about your selection process," Vextal said, observing a group of cadets helping their struggling classmate with heavy equipment. "How do you identify the strongest candidates for military service?" Kim followed the alien's gaze to the helpful cadets. "We look for different qualities than most species, Commander. Physical strength matters, but we're more interested in character, leadership potential, and moral courage." "Moral courage?" Vextal's 4 eyes blinked independently, a sign of confusion among his kind. "What relevance does morality have in warfare? Combat is about dominance, territory, and resources. Sentiment is a luxury that gets warriors killed." "Perhaps that's true for some species," Kim replied carefully. "But humans have learned that how we fight matters as much as whether we win. A victory achieved through dishonorable means often creates more problems than it solves." The alien commander made a mental note of this response. Such thinking explained why humanity remained confined to a single star system, while the Dominion controlled thousands of worlds. They were handicapped by unnecessary ethical constraints that more evolved species had long since abandoned. They passed a memorial wall lined with photographs and names. Vextal paused to examine the images of young human faces, noting the dates. Carved beneath each one, many had died decades ago in conflicts he'd never heard of. "Your casualties seem extensive for such a peaceful world," he observed. Kim's expression grew solemn. "These cadets gave their lives protecting others. We honor their sacrifice by remembering why they fought, not just that they died." They died for territory that no longer belongs to your nation, Vextal pointed out with brutal logic. Their sacrifice accomplished nothing permanent. Yet you memorialize failure? With respect, Commander, I think you misunderstand what they died for. Kim touched one of the photographs gently. They didn't die for territory or governments. They died for ideals, for people they'd never met, for principles bigger than themselves. That's not failure. That's the highest form of success our species recognizes. Vextal studied the human captain with growing interest. This conversation revealed more about humanity's military mindset than any intelligence briefing. These beings attached mystical significance to concepts that served no practical purpose in warfare. It was simultaneously fascinating and deeply concerning. The classroom door opened with a soft creak, revealing rows of young humans hunched over desks, scribbling notes as their instructor paced back and forth. Commander Vextal ducked through the doorway, his massive frame barely fitting through the human-sized entrance. He expected to find cadets studying weapon specifications, battle formations, or enemy weak points. Instead, he discovered something that made his four eyes narrow in bewilderment. Professor Minho Park stood at the front of the room, gesturing toward a holographic display showing ancient Earth conflicts. But instead of celebrating victories or analyzing tactical brilliance, he was discussing something called the ethics of warfare. Vexital's translator worked overtime as unfamiliar concepts flooded through the device. Can anyone tell me why the Geneva Conventions were created? Professor Park asked his students. A young cadet named Mina raised her hand eagerly. To establish rules that protect civilians and prisoners during wartime, sir. Even when fighting enemies, we have responsibilities. To innocent people caught in the crossfire. Vextal's mandibles clicked together sharply. In his experience, civilians were either useful resources to be captured or obstacles to be removed. The idea of protecting enemy non-combatants during active warfare struck him as dangerously naive. Another student, Tejo, shifted in his seat before speaking up. But Professor, what happens when following these rules puts our own soldiers at greater risk? Shouldn't protecting our own people come first? The question hung in the air for a moment. Vextal leaned forward, genuinely curious how these humans would resolve such an obvious contradiction. Any rational species would prioritize their own survival over abstract principles. A cadet named Hyun answered from the back row, her voice steady and confident. That's exactly when these rules matter most. Anyone can do the right thing when it's easy. True character shows when doing the right thing costs us something important. But lives could be lost, Tejo pressed. Real people with families, friends, futures. How do we justify that sacrifice for strangers? Because the moment we abandon our principles to save lives, we become no different from the enemies we're fighting, Mina replied. We'd win the battle, but lose everything that makes victory worth achieving. Vextal's breathing grew more rapid. These young humans were seriously debating whether to handicap themselves in combat for the sake of beings who weren't even their own species. It was the most irrational military doctrine he'd ever encountered. Professor Park nodded approvingly at his students' discussion. Excellent points, all of you. Now let's examine a historical case study. During the Korean War, UN forces faced a difficult choice when enemy combatants took shelter in a hospital filled with civilians. The holographic display shifted to show grainy footage of a bombed building with medical symbols clearly visible on its walls. Vextal studied the tactical situation immediately. The structure provided perfect cover for enemy forces, while preventing effective counterattack due to civilian presence. The logical solution was obvious. What would you do in this situation? The professor asked. Several hands shot up immediately. A cadet named Jiho spoke first. Establish a perimeter and attempt negotiation. If enemy forces are using human shields, direct assault becomes morally complicated regardless of tactical advantage. That could take days, another student pointed out. Meanwhile, those enemy forces could escape or call for reinforcements. Then we find another way, said a young woman named Sora. Maybe we evacuate the civilians first, or we use non-lethal methods to neutralize the threat. The harder path doesn't mean the wrong path. Vextal could contain himself no longer. His massive form rose from the chair specially brought for his visit, drawing startled looks from every human in the room. "This is madness," he rumbled, his voice filling the small space. "You speak of warfare as if it were some sort of gentleman's game with rules and boundaries." The classroom fell silent. Even Professor Park seemed taken aback by the alien commander's sudden outburst. But the students didn't cower or look away. Instead, they regarded him with curious, almost pitying expressions. "Commander, Professor," Park said carefully, "would you like to share your perspective on this scenario?" "My perspective?" Vextel's 4 eyes blazed with intensity. "Eliminate the threat by any means necessary. Civilian casualties are regrettable but acceptable when weighed against military objectives. This is how wars are won, how empires are built, how species survive." A uncomfortable silence stretched across the room. Finally, young Mina spoke up, her voice respectful but firm. "With respect, sir, that's exactly the kind of thinking these rules were designed to prevent. The moment we decide that innocent lives are acceptable losses, we stop being protectors and become conquerors." "And what is wrong with being conquerors?" Vextal demanded. "The strong dominate the weak. This is natural law throughout the galaxy, maybe for other species," Hyun replied quietly. "But humans have learned that true strength comes from restraint, not domination. Any species can destroy. Only a few can build something worth preserving." Captain Kim, who had been observing silently from the doorway, stepped forward. "Commander, perhaps you'd like to see our practical training exercises. Theory is one thing, but you might find our field applications more illuminating." Vextal nodded curtly, his mind reeling from what he'd witnessed. These humans weren't just inefficient. They were deliberately choosing to be inefficient. They were handicapping themselves in the name of principles that provided no tactical advantage whatsoever. As they left the classroom, he could hear the students resuming their discussion behind them, their voices animated and passionate. They genuinely believed in these impossible ideals. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds as recruits gathered for what they thought would be another routine exercise. But today was different. Today the real games would begin. Captain Rodriguez stood before the assembled group, his weathered face serious. "Listen up, soldiers. What you're about to experience isn't just practice anymore. These war games will test everything you've learned and push you beyond what you think you can handle." The recruits exchanged nervous glances. They had heard whispers about these exercises from older soldiers, stories that seemed too intense to be true. Now they would find out for themselves. The first challenge came without warning. Sirens wailed across the base as smoke grenades exploded around the barracks. Through the chaos, drill sergeants shouted orders that were barely audible above the noise. This wasn't the controlled environment they were used to. This was meant to feel real. "Move, move, move." The commands echoed from all directions as recruits scrambled to collect their gear. Some fumbled with their equipment while others moved with surprising efficiency. The training was already separating those who could think under pressure from those who froze when things got complicated. The war games lasted for days, not hours. Sleep became a luxury that came in short bursts between missions. Food was whatever, could be grabbed quickly during brief rest periods. The comfortable routine of regular training disappeared, replaced by the unpredictable rhythm of simulated combat. One particularly challenging scenario involved a mock rescue mission. Half the unit was designated as captured soldiers, while the other half had to plan and execute a rescue operation. The prisoners were kept in uncomfortable conditions, not dangerous but certainly unpleasant enough to create real stress. The rescue team faced multiple obstacles. They had to navigate through unfamiliar terrain in darkness, avoid detection by opposing forces, and coordinate their approach without modern communication devices. Every mistake had consequences that affected the entire mission. What made these exercises so powerful wasn't just the physical challenge. The psychological pressure was intense. Recruits had to make quick decisions with incomplete information, just like in real combat situations. They learned that hesitation could be just as dangerous as making the wrong choice. The opposing forces in these games weren't easy targets. Experienced soldiers played the enemy, using tactics that real adversaries might employ. They set traps, created diversions, and exploited every weakness they could find in the recruits' strategies. There was no mercy for mistakes. Some recruits struggled more than others. The young soldier from the countryside found the urban warfare scenarios particularly challenging. Streets and buildings created a maze of potential threats that felt foreign, compared to the open fields he knew well. But his teammates helped him adapt, showing how these exercises built not just individual skills, but team unity. Night operations added another layer of complexity. Moving silently through darkness while carrying full equipment required skills that couldn't be learned from textbooks. The fear of being detected created real tension. Even though everyone knew this was training, the mind doesn't always distinguish between simulation and reality when stress levels are high. Communication became crucial during these extended exercises. When radio equipment failed as part of the scenario, soldiers had to rely on hand signals and careful coordination. They learned that technology could fail at the worst possible moment, and backup plans were essential. The weather didn't cooperate, either. Rain turned the training ground into muddy obstacles that made everything harder. Cold nights tested endurance while hot days challenged stamina. These conditions weren't added difficulties. They were realistic elements that soldiers might face anywhere in the world. Medical scenarios were woven throughout the exercises. Soldiers had to provide first aid to wounded teammates while under simulated enemy fire. The pressure to save lives while protecting themselves created emotional stress that was surprisingly intense, even in a training environment. Leadership opportunities emerged naturally during these games. When designated leaders were eliminated from scenarios, others had to step up immediately. Some discovered leadership abilities they didn't know they possessed, while others learned they preferred supporting roles. The final day brought the most challenging scenario yet. Multiple objectives had to be accomplished simultaneously across a large area. Success required perfect coordination between different teams, each handling separate but interconnected missions. Failure in one area affected everyone else. As the HFY War games concluded, exhausted soldiers gathered to discuss what they had learned. The experience had changed them in ways that regular training never could. They had discovered personal limits and learned to push beyond them. More importantly, they had developed trust in their teammates that only comes from facing challenges together. These war games weren't just about military skills. They revealed character, built resilience, and created bonds that would last throughout their service. The recruits who emerged from this experience were no longer the same people who had entered. They had been tested by fire and proven themselves ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The transformation was complete. They were no longer just recruits following orders. They had become soldiers, ready to face whatever the world might demand of them. The fourth week arrived like a storm nobody saw coming. Everything the recruits thought they knew about their limits was about to be shattered. This wasn't just another step in training. This was the moment where minds and bodies would be pushed to places they had never gone before. It started before dawn, with an alarm that felt different from all the others. The sound was harsher, more urgent, cutting through sleep like a knife. When the lights flickered on, there was something in the drill sergeant's eyes that hadn't been there before. Today would be unlike anything they had experienced. "You think you know what tired feels like?" Sergeant Williams called out as recruits stumbled from their bunks. "You think you understand pressure? Today you learn what those words really mean." The first challenge came immediately. No time for the usual morning routine, no breakfast, no chance to fully wake up. They were thrown straight into a grueling obstacle course that seemed to stretch on forever. But this wasn't the familiar course they had trained on. This was bigger, harder, and designed to break spirits as much as test bodies. Each obstacle demanded everything they had. Rope climbs that burned their hands raw, wall climbs that left muscles screaming, crawling under barbed wire through mud that seemed to pull them down like quicksand. And just when they thought they were done, another section appeared ahead. The young recruit from the small farming town felt his confidence crumbling. His legs shook with exhaustion, and his breathing came in ragged gasps. Around him, others were struggling just as badly. Some had already collapsed, unable to continue. The sight of his fellow recruits giving up made his own situation feel even more hopeless. But the physical challenges were only the beginning. Sleep deprivation became a weapon used against them. Just when they thought they could rest, new orders would come. Emergency drills in the middle of the night, surprise inspections that required perfect attention to detail when their minds could barely function. Food became scarce and unpredictable. Sometimes meals were skipped entirely because of emergency situations. When food was available, they had only minutes to eat before the next activity began. Hunger became a constant companion, making every other challenge feel twice as difficult. The psychological pressure intensified with each passing hour. Drill sergeants seemed to find every weakness, every fear, every insecurity that each recruit carried. They weren't cruel for the sake of being cruel. They were systematically breaking down the civilian mindset that still lingered in these young soldiers. "You think your mommy is going to come save you out here?" One sergeant shouted at a recruit who was struggling with homesickness. "You think the enemy cares that you miss your comfortable bed? Wake up. This is your reality now." The breaking point came at different times for different people. For some, it was during a particularly brutal training exercise, where they had to carry heavy equipment for miles without stopping. For others, it happened during the night when exhaustion and isolation combined to create overwhelming despair. The recruit from the city found himself crying for the first time since childhood. The tears came without warning during what should have been a routine marching drill. Everything felt impossible. His body hurt in ways he didn't know were possible, and his mind felt clouded by fatigue and stress. Around him, others were having their own moments of crisis. One young woman sat on the ground, staring blankly ahead, seemingly unable to process the orders being shouted at her. Another recruit kept repeating the same mistake over and over, his concentration completely shattered. This wasn't failure. This was the point of the entire exercise. The instructors weren't trying to destroy these young people. They were breaking down the walls that prevent ordinary humans from accessing extraordinary strength. Sometimes you have to completely fall apart before you can rebuild yourself into something stronger. The turning point came when recruits started helping each other in ways they never had before. When someone collapsed during a run, others didn't just keep going. They stopped, helped their fellow soldier up, and found ways to support each other through the impossible tasks. The farm boy who had been struggling found new energy when he saw a teammate about to give up. Something inside him shifted. Instead of focusing on his own pain, he started encouraging others. "Come on, we can do this together," he said, surprised by the strength in his own voice. Slowly, something remarkable began to happen. The group that had entered this phase as individuals started moving as a unit. They developed an unspoken understanding of each other's strengths and weaknesses. When one person faltered, others were there to compensate. The drill sergeants watched this transformation with satisfaction. This was what they had been waiting for. The moment when a collection of separate people became a team. The breaking point wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something much more powerful. By the time this phase concluded, every recruit had discovered reserves of strength they never knew existed. They had learned that the human spirit could endure far more than they had ever imagined. Most importantly, they had learned they didn't have to face impossible challenges alone. The morning after the breaking point felt different. There was something in the air that the recruits couldn't quite identify. The same drill sergeants who had pushed them to their limits now looked at them with what almost seemed like respect. Something fundamental had changed, but nobody could explain exactly what. Captain Rodriguez appeared earlier than usual, walking slowly through the barracks as recruits prepared for another day they assumed would be filled with impossible challenges. But instead of barking orders, he simply observed. His eyes moved from face to face, studying each person as if seeing them for the first time. "Gather around," he said quietly. The tone was so different from everything they had experienced that it caught everyone off guard. There was no urgency, no threat of punishment for moving too slowly. Just a simple request that felt almost conversational. The recruits formed a circle, still expecting some new form of torture disguised as training. Their bodies were still sore from the previous weeks, their minds still adjusting to the constant state of alertness that had become their new normal. But something in the captain's posture suggested this moment would be different. "Do you know what happened to you yesterday?" he asked, looking around the group. Nobody answered immediately. They had been broken down, pushed beyond what they thought possible, forced to discover strength they didn't know they possessed. But the captain seemed to be asking about something deeper. One of the recruits, the young woman who had stared blankly during the worst moments, slowly raised her hand. "We learned we could do more than we thought we could," she said hesitantly. The captain nodded but gestured for her to continue. "What else?" The farm boy who had found his voice while helping others spoke up. "We learned we're stronger together than we are alone." His words carried weight that surprised even him. The simple statement seemed to capture something important that had happened during their darkest moments. "You're both right," Captain Rodriguez said, "but there's something bigger that you need to understand. Something that will change how you see everything that happened to you here." He paused, letting the silence build tension. The recruits leaned forward unconsciously, drawn by the promise of understanding that had eluded them for weeks. "What you experienced wasn't just training," he continued. "It was a transformation that humans have been going through for thousands of years. Every person who has ever faced impossible circumstances and emerged stronger has walked the same path you just walked." The revelation began to unfold slowly. The captain explained that the military had studied human psychology and performance. For decades, they had learned that ordinary people possessed extraordinary capabilities, but these abilities remained hidden until circumstances forced them to surface. "The breaking point isn't about destroying who you are," he said. "It's about removing the mental barriers that prevent you from accessing your full potential. Every human being has these barriers. They're built from fear, doubt, and limiting beliefs about what's possible." One recruit asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "So everything we went through was planned? Even the parts that felt completely impossible?" "Every single challenge was designed based on scientific research about human performance under extreme conditions," the captain confirmed. "We know exactly how much pressure it takes to break down old thinking patterns. We know how to create situations where people discover capabilities they never knew they had." The psychological aspects became clearer as he continued explaining. The sleep deprivation wasn't meant to punish them. It was designed to bypass the rational mind that constantly says, "I can't do this." When exhaustion clouds normal thinking, people often perform beyond their usual limitations because they stop overthinking their actions. The food restrictions served a similar purpose. Hunger creates a primal drive that overrides comfort-seeking behaviors. When the body is focused on survival, it stops wasting energy on self-doubt and fear of failure. Even the harsh words from drill sergeants had a specific purpose. They weren't meant to hurt feelings, but to trigger emotional responses that would reveal each person's deepest fears and insecurities. Once these hidden obstacles were exposed, they could be addressed and overcome. "The moment you started helping each other instead of just focusing on your own struggles," the captain said, "that's when the real transformation began. You discovered that individual strength multiplies when it's combined with teamwork and mutual support." The recruit from the city, who had cried during that difficult marching drill, suddenly understood why that moment had been so important. "You wanted us to break down so we could build ourselves back up differently," he said. "Exactly. The person who entered this training program isn't the same person sitting here today. Your brain has literally rewired itself to handle stress, pressure, and challenges in completely new ways. You've developed neural pathways that didn't exist before." The science behind their transformation was fascinating. Under extreme stress, the human brain creates new connections and strengthens existing ones related to problem-solving, teamwork, and resilience. These changes become permanent, meaning the capabilities they had discovered would remain with them for life. As the full scope of their transformation became clear, the recruits looked at each other with new understanding. They weren't just stronger physically. They had become fundamentally different people. The impossible had become possible because they had learned to think beyond their previous limitations. The revelation changed everything they thought they knew about human potential and the purpose of their training.